And speaking of corporals,
Oh, yes, your friends who got into a little trouble. Well, don't worry. I've told they're good boys who just made a few mistakes. I'm sure we can manage to give them another chance.
oh, I do hope so. Danny is such a good person. He just has terrible luck, that's all.
If I chase you, then you get caught. And once I got you, I go my way. Can you bring your go?
What's good, everybody? RJ here, and this is Coffee and Convos. Welcome back to the channel. This is my reading voice. This is a space for conversation, thought, and reflection. I'm here to think out loud, ask better questions, and challenge the stories we're told to accept without examination. You're welcome here. So grab a cup, take a breath, and let's have a real conversation. I want to be clear before anything else is said. I love Black women's sexuality in all its forms. There's nothing wrong with expression. There's nothing wrong with desire. There's nothing wrong with a Black woman choosing how she presents herself to the world. That is agency. That is autonomy. That is freedom. What I question is not expression. What I question is the pattern. Because when something repeats itself across decades, across institutions, across culture, it stops being coincidence. It becomes structure. A structure always has history. The Oscars and the pattern of recognition. Before we talk about archetypes, we have to talk about what is being rewarded. Because what culture celebrates tells you what it values. And the Academy Awards have shown a consistent pattern when it comes to Black stories. Driving Miss Daisy wins Best Picture, grounded in a relationship built on servitude and patience. The Help is recognized through performances rooted in domestic labor and emotional endurance. Green Book wins Best Picture, framing racism through the transformation of a white character. 12 Years a Slave wins Best Picture, centered on extreme Black suffering. To Kill a Mockingbird is celebrated with a white moral figure at the center of Black injustice. And there's The Color Purple, a deeply rooted Black narrative, nominated 11 times and awarded nothing. Monique won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress in her role in Precious, delivering a performance that was undeniably powerful, yet rooted in a portrayal that aligns with a long-standing pattern where Black womanhood is framed through trauma, abuse, and dysfunction, raising the same critical question presented throughout this essay. When there is these roles most consistently recognized, what does it say about the industry choosing to see it, how to use it, how it continues to define Black identity, a narrow and often harmful lens? Even Crash, a film widely criticized for flattening racism into a series of individual misunderstandings while sidestepping deeper systematic realities, still walked away with Best Picture. The film reduces complex racial dynamics into moments that can be resolved through personal reflection rather than a structural change. In doing so, it offers something easier to digest, something that reassures others than it challenges it. The Academy does not ignore race. It returns to it repeatedly, but within a narrow frame. Black stories from the Academy are mostly consistently elevated when they're about Black suffering, about servitude, about racial tension, or about negative proximity to whiteness. That is not random. That is a preference. There's a darker layer that cannot be ignored, because the distortion of Black bodies did not begin in media. It began in slavery, started when European paradigm of white supremacy was used as a tool in colonization, in production, in subjugation and oppression. To break Black men, systems of power did not rely on violence alone. They attacked dignity, identity, and family. Enslaved men were stripped of ability to protect, to provide, to stand as fathers in a recognized way. That was not accidental. That was strategy. At the same time, black women were reduced to function, not just labor, but reproduction. They were used as what can be described as forced breeding vessels. Their bodies turned into sites of economic production. Children were not simply born, they were produced into slavery. Frederick Douglass speaks to the reality in his own life. He recalls being separated from his mother at a young age and rarely seeing her, a deliberate practice meant to sever emotional bonds. He also writes about his grandmother, who, after years of labor and bearing children into slavery, was discarded and left alone in the woods once she was no longer useful. That is not just cruelty. That is objectification in its purest form, a human life reduced to output. And this is where the distortion begins. Black women were not seen as women to be protected. They were just seen as bodies to be used. And black men were not seen as men to be respected. They were seen as threats to be controlled or tools to be broken. And when sexuality is shaped inside of that system, it does not emerge clean on the other side of history. That is not just cruelty, that is objectification. It carries residue. So when we talk about the Jezebel archetype, we're not talking about an image, we're talking about justification, a narrative created to make exploitation appear natural. And when we talk about the modern portrayal of black sexuality, especially in spaces where power is uneven, where desire is tied to domination, where vulnerability is tied to access, we are not looking at something new. We're looking at something refined. The system may have changed its language, but the lens has not fully disappeared. The archetypes that made it possible, these patterns did not begin in Hollywood. They began in slavery, as stated before. It started with the Eurocentric paradigm of white supremacy, the idea to change the image of people that are oppressed. The idea of that propaganda shapes ideas and systems. Black people were not only oppressed, they were defined in ways that made the system make sense. Scholars like Patricia Hill Collins call them controlling images. The Jezebel framed black women as hypersexual, always desiring, always available. The Mammy framed them as nurturing, loyal, and safe. The Sapphire framed them as aggressive and irrational. For black men, there were parallel constructions: the brute, violent, dangerous, sexually threatening; the coon, foolish, unserious, existing only for entertainment. These were not just merely misunderstandings. They were inventions with purpose. Historians like Deborah Gray White and thinkers like Angela Davis show how these images justified exploitation and control. If a black woman were Jezebels, exploitation could be explained. If black men were brutes, violence could be justified. That is how narrative protects power. Brings us to now. To one battle after another, the character of Perfidia Beverly Hills, played by Tiana Taylor. From the beginning, Perfidia is not written as passive. She's positioned inside a revolutionary group, French 75, moving with intention, surrounded by ideology, conflict, and violence. She is part of leadership. She makes decisions, she carries presence. But also immediately, the film introduces something else alongside that power. In her first interaction with Colonel Stephen J. Lockjaw.
Wake up, soldier boy. You died and went to pussy heaven, motherfucker. Put your arms to the side so I can see you. What's your name, dickhead?
I'm Captain Stephen J. Lockjaw.
We're here to right your wrongs, motherfucker. You got an army growing in your fucking guts and you put it there. The message is clear. Free borders, free bodies, free choices, and free from fucking fear. Up. Good boy. Get on your fucking knees. Now. Right on. And get the fuck up.
A white supremacist figure, Perfidia engages him through sexuality, not subtle, directly. She commands arousal. And in that moment, the film establishes a dynamic that matters more than the scene itself. Lockjaw does not just oppose her politically, he becomes fixated on her sexually. The fixation is not neutral, it's racial. It is obsessive. It's rooted in domination and desire at the same time. And this is where the deeper layer reveals itself. Because the Jezebel archetype was never just about black women being sexual. It was about her sexuality being consumed, pursued, and distorted through the lens of a white male gaze. Perfidia is written as someone aware of this dynamic. She even names it. She treats her sexuality as a tool, something transactional, something weaponized. At one point, she frames it not as pleasure, but as strategy, not as intimacy, but as leverage. But on the surface, that reads as agency. But underneath it, something more complicated is happening. Because the same system that once constructed black women as hypersexual is now being navigated, manipulated, and survived by the character herself. And the film does not fully escape that tension. As the story unfolds, Lockjaw's obsession becomes central. His pursuit of Perfidia is not just political, it is personal, possessive, fetishistic. Even when she's captured, even when she attempts to use sexuality as means of survival, the power dynamic is not equal. It never is, because fetishization is not about mutual desire. It is about control disguised as attraction. And even when Perfidia uses that dynamic to her advantage, the cost is clear. Her decisions fracture the group. Her actions lead to betrayal. Her body becomes both a weapon and vulnerability at the same time. That contradiction is not accidental. It reflects a larger history. A history where black women were forced into roles where survival and sexuality became entangled. Where being seen, desired, and used existed in the same space. So the question is not whether Perfidia is complex. She absolutely is. The question is, why does her complexity still move through a structure that still feels so familiar? Why does power, sexuality, and white male obsession still intersect in the ways that echo something older than the film itself? Because when the pattern shows up again, even in modern, layered, well-acted performances, it forces us to confront something uncomfortable. Not about the character, about the lens that continues to shape her. The Monsters Ball earned Halle Berry the Academy Award. It was historic. But history does not erase the pattern, it reveals it. Berry's character, Leticia, is introduced through collapse. Her life is defined by loss, poverty, and isolation. Her husband is executed. Her son dies shortly after. What remains is a woman stripped down emotionally, psychologically, and materially. That is the foundation of the film. And it matters, because the relationship that follows does not emerge from stability, it emerges from trauma. Leticia enters into a sexual relationship with Hank, played by Billy Bob Thornton, a white man who is not just adjacent to her suffering, but directly connected to it. He's part of the system that executed her husband. That connection is not distant, it is intimate, it is structural. And yet, the film moves towards closeness, towards intimacy, toward one of the most remembered scenes in modern cinema.
You make me feel good. You can feel good.
That moment is not just about sex. It is about vulnerability expressed through the body. And this is where the deeper layer has to be addressed. Because Jezebel archetypes were never simply about black women being sexual. It was about her being sexually available within a system that did not value her humanity. In Monsters Ball, Leticia is not portrayed as powerful in that moment. She is grieving, exhausted, broken, open. And it is the state that intimacy is introduced, and that matters. When sexuality is tied to vulnerability in this way, especially in proximity to a white male figure, it begins to echo something older, something rooted in imbalance, something rooted in access. Hank is not written as a conqueror. The film complicates him and humanizes him, but the structure of the relationship still carries weight because even without intention, history does not disappear from the frame, it lingers. What we are watching is not just connection between two people. We're watching a dynamic where power is uneven, trauma is fresh, and intimacy becomes a form of release within that imbalance. And that is where the question becomes unavoidable. Why is this the role that breaks through? Why is Black female vulnerability expressed through sexuality tied to grief and placed in proximity to white male characters, the performance that becomes more historic? Again, that is not a critique on Halle Berry. Her performance was undeniable. The question is about what the industry chooses to recognize, because when a specific type of portrayal is consistently elevated, it tells us something about what is being seen, and more importantly, how it is being seen. Before Halle Berry, there was Dorthy Dandridge. In Carmen Jones, Dandridge plays Carmen, a character defined by passion, desire, and sensuality. She's magnetic, powerful, and unforgettable, but she's also framed through the lens of desirability. Sexuality is central to how she is perceived. That role made history. It brought visibility, it opened doors, but it also reinforced a pattern. Dandridge became one of the first Black women to be elevated in Hollywood in a role that aligned closely to the Jezebel archetype. Decades later, Halle Berry, who portrayed her in introducing Dorthy Dandridge, honoring her legacy while stepping into the same historical pattern. And even earlier, actors like Harry Belafonte work within the system, talented, charismatic, undeniable, yet often navigating roles shaped by how Black bodies were expected to be seen and consumed. This is not about diminishing their greatness. It is about recognizing the structure they had to move through, because talent gets you noticed, but historically, certain types of roles get you recognized. Black sexuality in America has never been neutral. It has been shaped before it was ever expressed. Where Black women's sexuality was framed as access, for Black men's sexuality was framed as a threat. Frantz Fanon writes that the Black body is turned into projection, not as simply a human being, but something seen, interpreted, and defined through the eyes of the others. That applies directly to sexuality. Fetishization is not appreciation, it is distortion. It reduces a person to a function, and during slavery, that distortion was to justify exploitation. Black sexuality in America has never been neutral. It was shaped before it was ever expressed. For Black women, sexuality is framed as access, too open, too available, too willing. The Jezebel archetype did not describe behavior. It assigned meaning to the body itself. For Black men, sexuality is framed as danger, not just desire, but threat, not intimacy, but aggression. That is not accidental. It is constructed. Frantz Fanon writes in Black Skin, White Mask that the Black body becomes something more than itself under a racialized system. It becomes a symbol, a project, fear, desire. He argues that the Black man is not a man. He is a man in relation to a white man. That same logic extends sexuality. Black sexuality is not allowed to exist on its own terms. It is interpreted through a lens that predates the individual, a lens shaped by slavery, power, and control. That is where fetishization comes from, because fetishization is often mistaken for appreciation. That is not the same. Appreciation sees a person. Fetishization sees a function. It isolates one aspect of someone and their body, their perceived sexuality, and their physical presence, and elevates it while ignoring the rest. It reduces complexity into something consumable. During slavery, the distortion had a purpose. Black women were framed as insatiable, so the violation could be justified. Black men framed sexuality as dangerous, so the violence of them could be conducted as rational. As Angela Davis explains in Women, Race, and Class, the sexual exploitation of Black women was not hidden. It is normalized through ideology. The narrative comes first, the violence followed. And that narrative does not disappear just because the conditions change. It adapts. So when we see modern portrayals where Black women are constantly positioned as sexual expressive with unequal dynamics, Black men are framed through intensity, aggression, physical dominance, we're not looking at isolated creative choices. We're looking at echoes of constructed past. That distortion is not always obvious, but is persistent. And when persistence is what turns an image into belief. To understand why these patterns continue, you have to understand the lens. Who is being looked at matters, and who controls the image matters even more. Bell Hooks describes this Black looks, race, and representation as the oppositional gaze. She argues that Black people historically were not meant to be subjects in visual culture, but objects, seen, defined, interpreted, but rarely allowed to define themselves. Bell Hooks writes, "The power is in looking." And she also makes clear that power is not equally distributed, because when one group controls the image, they also control the meaning of what is seen. That is where the concept of the white gaze becomes important. It is not just about race, it is about perspective. A perspective that historically framed Black bodies as exotic, dangerous, desirable, or disposable, depending on what the moment required. So when Black women's sexuality is presented on screen, the question is not just what is being shown. The question is, who is it being shown for? If the framing of sexuality consistently aligns with vulnerability, access, imbalance, or spectacle, then the gaze is not neutral, it's shaped. Patricia Hill Collins builds on this by describing these reoccurring patrols as controlling images, frames that limit how Black women are understood and accepted. These images do not eliminate agency, but they shape the environment in which agency is expressed. Because if certain portrayals are constantly funded, promoted, and rewarded for those portrayals to begin with and define what is acceptable. And over time, what is acceptable becomes to feel natural. That is how systems maintain themselves, not just through force, but through repetition, through normalization, through the quiet shaping of perception. As Angela Davis explains, Black women's bodies were positioned in a way that normalized violation before it even occurred. The narrative came first, the violence followed. That logic did not disappear, it evolved. So when Black women are repeatedly framed as objects of desire within unequal power dynamics, especially with white men, it is not just storytelling. It is historical residue. I want to say this clearly. I'm not against Black sexuality, and I'm not against expression. But there's a difference between freedom and pattern. Freedom is the ability to choose, but real freedom is the ability to choose outside the expectations and still be valued. And if one type of image is consistently elevated, then the system is not neutral. What began as justification became narrative, and what became narrative became entertainment, and what became entertainment became recognition. The archetypes did not disappear. They were redefined and repeated. Black women are not objects. Black men are not threats. And neither should be understood through images created to justify control. But when those same images continue to appear, then we're not just looking at culture. We're looking at history continuing to speak. So the question remains, if these same images continue to be rewarded in the same patterns and they continue to appear, if the same dynamics continue to be elevated, then we have to ask, is this progress or repetition? I'm not against the image. I'm against the history behind the lens that keeps choosing it. And until the lens is questioned, it will keep choosing the same story, one battle after another. Thank you for taking this time, for having this conversation with me. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. We have merch for sale down in the description box. And be you, do you, see the bigger picture. Until next time, stay safe.